Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Nab, and as I imagine most of you know, this is the first of a series of Zoom group discussions of my new book, The Joy of Revolution and Related Texts. So I'm not going to go into detail about this because in the process you will find out more about me and about these writings, so it will be pretty self-evident. I wrote The Joy of Revolution back in 1997, or in the preceding years, but that was when it was first published, and as part of another book called Public Secrets. And I reissued this with at PM Press, just came out a couple months ago. And in the process, I added a lot of other things after Joy of Revolution, about the Occupy movement and Trump and various other more recent topics. So what we're going to do is largely Q&A, where you can ask. I'm going to read little excerpts from the first two chapters and then kind of lead in, and you can ask about what that means. And you can also comment or, say other things. But mostly, given that I'm the author, it makes sense. Like you're going to say, well, what did you mean by that? Or if you meant, doesn't that contradict blah, blah, blah? I mean, you may have all sorts of questions for me to clarify what I was saying, and then I can answer them. And I think that will segue into various other issues. So I'm going to start out just reading the table of contents for the first chapter. The first chapter, which I call Facts of Life, is just sort of a preliminary thing where it says, what is revolution? What kind of revolution are we talking about? Why is it an issue? What are common misconceptions about different kinds of revolutions, etc. And so this has some subchapters. The first is called Utopia or Bust. And then Stalinist communism and reformist socialism are merely variants of capitalism. So as to clarify that. Representative democracy versus delegate democracy. Irrationalities of capitalism. Some exemplary modern revolts. Some common objections, like how can this ever happen? Revolution is out of date, etc. And then increasing dominance of the spectacle. So we'll plunge right into the first subchapter, Utopia or Bust. And here's some excerpts. Never in history has there been such a glaring contrast between what could be and what actually exists. It's hardly necessary to go into all the problems in the world today. Most of them are widely known, and to dwell on them usually does little more than dull us to their reality. But the point is that even those who don't face direct physical repression still have to face the mental repressions imposed by an increasingly mean, stressful, ignorant, and ugly world. Those who escape economic poverty cannot escape the general impoverishment of life. And even life at this pitiful level cannot continue for long. The ravaging of the planet by the global development of capitalism has brought us to the point where humanity may become extinct within a few decades. Yet this same development has made it possible to abolish the system of hierarchy and exploitation that was previously based on material scarcity, and to inaugurate a new, genuinely liberated form of society. What is needed, I believe, is a worldwide participatory democracy revolution that would abolish both capitalism and the state. This is admittedly a big order, but I'm afraid that nothing less can get to the root of our problems. It may seem absurd to talk about revolution, but all the alternatives assume the continuation of the present system, which is even more absurd. So, any comments on questions about that? Mike, unmute yourself.
One thing I've sort of have a question about is how can a world revolution take place all at once? My own experience is that it probably and I differentiate between social revolution and political revolution. The political revolution replacing, one class with another form of class domination, and a social revolution going from a class society to a classless society. So my question would be, how? I mean, it seems by putting it that way that you're relying on a kind of event that I can't see happening, considering the differences in culture and so forth and so on between nation states that exist at the moment.
Yeah.
And as you say, we're up against the wall when it comes to time.
Yeah. Okay. So this may sound like cheating, but I go into that in chapter 3, which we'll be
Okay.
talking about 2 weeks from now. So, to some extent, all these things are intertwined for sure. But
Okay.
this here, I'm just presenting this opening thing, like just saying,
Okay.
I'm afraid that nothing less than this will do. It's all da da da. And now we're going to go on. It's just sort of like the little overture. Craig,
Okay.
unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. When I was reading this, I found it really refreshing. And also it reminded me a little bit of a critique that has sort of been developing, I think, in some of the radical and communist left around like a different look at revolution and criticizing the sort of one event notion of revolution as like millenarianism and problematic in that it looks at it sort of as this one event. And the examples that you gave, Hungary, the Spanish Revolution, 68, I was curious if you had a sort of response to the idea that I think is, and I wish it wasn't, but is becoming more popular in radical thought, that positing revolution as a sort of singular event that happens is itself a problematic notion of revolution.
Well, again, when we get to chapter 3, I'll be going into those kind of things more. But I would say it's a complex thing about, does it happen all at once? Like revolution does happen all at once, but it also builds up. I mean, those you can't just say, well, how is it going to happen? And it's this way and not that way. And in fact, all we can do is look at certain ways that things have happened in the past, and we find that in many cases, it was not very predictable. Why did one thing touch it off and something else, even worse conditions, didn't touch anything off? And some of them, anyway, some of these things that people said, oh, this is impossible, yada, da, 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 and then they happened. And then other times people said, oh, surely this will provoke a revolution, and nothing much happens. So there are more details to go in there, and this book doesn't answer all those things. It's just that I try to present that various uncertain, that precise uncertainty, for example, that it is confusing. Like, is this a revolution? Was May 68 a revolution or not? Was, da da da. So I'd like to skip on from there, but that issue will come up. Danny.
And I'll read a question in the chat from Ed. Ken, as for capitalism, you mean that work or wage labor and money should be abolished, right?
Right. Kim.
I wanted to make a comment. It's not really a question. The one line in one of the first paragraphs, those who don't face direct physical repression still have to face the mental repressions imposed by an increasingly mean, stressful, ignorant, and ugly world. I really appreciated that statement because it reminded me of the brutal extermination that's been taking place in Gaza due to the Zeo-fascist in the United States, NATO, and Israel. And many of my friends have been experiencing this for, well, now 3 years. So I just wanted to make an appreciation of a comment or a statement like that
Yeah.
you made.
Thank you. So I'm going to keep moving on. There's a lot of these things here, and then we'll see if we get through this, we can go into more detail. The second subchapter is Stalinist communism and reformist socialism, so-called, are merely variants of capitalism. And I'm not even going to go into detail here. That line, that title already sums it up. Basically, if you say, oh, well, Russia, China, blah, 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 I'm saying that those are different kinds of capitalism. That's not what I'm talking about. And even though people think, oh, Russia opposite because it's the state owns everything or something like that. And I'm saying just the rather obvious fact that we've had a century, more than a century since that, and within a few decades of that, it was glaringly obvious that Stalinism, those things have nothing to do with Marx. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. It's much more similar to Nazism or something. And things like Leninism and Trotskyism may be a little more dubious there, but they end up leading to the same kind of statist dictatorship. So then I'd like to go on to the next two subchapters have to do with the political aspect and the economic aspect of what we're talking about. And so I artificially separate those things. So this third subchapter, I'm just saying, let's look at the different kinds of political systems there are. They can be in a very oversimplified form. I say we can roughly distinguish 5 degrees of so-called government. The first one is unrestricted freedom, period. We'll find out what that means. The second one is direct democracy. And that can be broken down to 2 things, consensus democracy or majority rule, but it's direct. And then the third one is delegate. It's not direct, majority rule. The third one is delegate democracy, and that is more direct. And we'll go into that in a minute. Then representative democracy. And then the fifth one is overt minority dictatorship. So the difference I want to make in this one is between numbers 3 and 4, which is delegate democracy and representative democracy. In representative democracy, people advocate their power to elected officials. The candidates' stated policies are limited to a few vague generalities, and once they are elected, there is little control over their actual decisions on hundreds of issues, apart from the feeble threat of changing one's vote a few years later to some equally uncontrollable rival politician. Representatives are dependent on the wealthy for bribes and campaign conferences. I won't go into all this is obvious. In delegate democracy, in contrast, delegates are elected for specific purposes with very specific limitations. They may be strictly mandated, ordered to vote in a certain way on a certain issue, or the mandate may be left open, delegates being free to vote as they think best, with the people who have elected them reserving the right to confirm or reject any decision thus taken. Delegates are generally elected for very short periods and are subject to recall at any time. Obviously, this is glaringly different than representative democracy. So then I'm just giving an overview here, but I point out that these delegate things, this isn't something that I just thought up or that somebody thought up. They have come up in practical struggles. In fact, they were invented in 1905 by striking workers in Russia. And anyway, they reappeared in things like the Spanish Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, and so on. Then maybe we can stop there for any comments or questions. Mike?
I would just like to, I think there's a differentiation between bourgeois democracy, representative democracy, and if you had a classless society and representative democracy. That said, I'm an advocate of delegate democracy, but I don't think you get delegate democracy unless you have a classless society. So, I mean, for instance, in Russia, I mean, it may have occurred in a few factories, but it didn't occur throughout the whole of Tsarist Russia by any stretch of the
No,
imagination.
but the point is that it's a hint of what can happen. It's
Sure,
not
yeah,
like no political leader said, hey, workers, you ought to form workers, da. The workers
right,
themselves in practice found that that was the only thing that made sense. And
right,
so
yeah,
if they do that, then 30 years later in Spain, you had a similar situation where like the 1905 Russian Revolution was brief. And like, as you say, just in one or two big cities. But in
mhm,
Spain, it wasn't just for a few weeks, it was for months. And it was not just in a city or two, it was all over the countryside. And it was ongoing. In other words, it wasn't just a little thing like how do workers in one factory organize themselves. It ended up being how do workers in a city organize themselves or in a province organize themselves. And they ended up doing that. So that's as close as we've come to that. But the point is, we can see that this is not just some idle fantasy. You can see, oh, the factories ran, successfully, and they made what they needed. In that case, they needed food and stuff, and they also needed to make weapons to fight the fascists and, under unfavorable circumstances, but they were able to do that. So again, when we get to chapters 3 and 4, we'll talk about a little more of the nuances of those things. But this is just, I'm just outlining. Here's some things we're talking about. so people don't just say, oh, is it democracy or dictatorship? We have to go,
Right.
what kind of democracy? And what I'm saying here is that the revolutionary things tend to be delegate democracy. And that's sort of the first thing we're looking at.
Right. I remember that Lenin, in his 1903 document about what is to be done, said that the workers by themselves could only come to trade union consciousness. But in 1905, it was the women weavers, workers in Ivanovo, north of Moscow, who invented the Soviet, the
Yeah.
Workers' Council.
Yeah. So, and Rosa Luxemburg pointed this out, by the way. You know, she said, I told you so. They could do this in contrast to Lenin. So I want to go on to the next subchapter called Irrationalities of Capitalism. And this is more complicated. It's kind of easy to understand who's bossing who around or something. Economic things are much subtler. And so I said, we can look at economic organization from the angle of work, i.e., is it totally voluntary? Is it cooperative? Or is it forced and exploitive? And if it is forced, there's two kinds of subcategory there. Either it's overtly forced, like slave labor, or disguised, i.e., wage labor. So in both of those latter two cases, it's forced. You're working because you have to. And if you don't, and you're a slave, maybe you get whipped or something. If you don't, and you're a free worker, so-called, you are free to starve or live in the street because you didn't get a job or whatever. And then we can also look at it from economic things from the angle of distribution. One, true communism means totally free accessibility. Have anything you want. Two, true socialism, collective ownership and regulation. And three, capitalism, where you have private and or state ownership. The state would be another kind of private ownership. So in let's see. So I go into various nuances about that. I'm not going to go. So does anybody have any comments or questions about that issue or that subchapter? Yeah, Mike, I'd like other people to.
Sorry,
I
I just want to point out one thing. The way Marx and Engels used the concept socialism and communism were interchangeable. They always meant a classless society without a state, but they did advocate a proletarian democracy, which evolved into what they call the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right. And they pointed to the Paris Commune as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. Thank you. So, yeah, we will come back to all these things. Bear in mind, this opening chapter is just sort of an outline. So any other questions or comments on capitalism, this sort of distinction? So going on to the next one, some exemplary modern revolts. And so now I'm saying, well, are these kind of revolutions likely? And my answer is the odds are probably against it. I'm talking about a global revolution. So right up front, I'm not saying that this is likely or that it's certainly not that it's certain to happen. And the reason it's not certain to happen is a lot of obvious things. Like, for one thing, we don't have much time. And when we've got climate change and all these other crazinesses going on, it's quite possible that the world, there's a nuclear war or, a complete oceans, any number of things end up fucking up things so badly that it becomes hard to do anything other than just struggle for sheer survival, like some dystopians, dystopian science fiction novel. But I do say most revolutions have been preceded by periods when everybody scoffed at the idea that things could ever change. Despite many discouraging trends in the world, there are also some encouraging signs, not least of which is the widespread disillusionment with previous false alternatives. Many popular revolts in this century have already moved spontaneously in the right direction. And I'm not referring to these so-called successful revolutions like Russia and China and so on, which are frauds, but less known radical efforts. And I mentioned Russia in 1905, Germany 1918, Italy 1920, Asturias, Spain, Spanish Revolution, Hungary 1956, May 68 in France, Czechoslovakia 1968, Portugal 1974, Poland 1980, 81, and so on. So all of these things, whether you call them revolutions or just rather extreme revolts, are, you know, they say, oh, yeah, that could happen. Like, and people, before they happened, nobody ever, you know, if you were in France in 1967, nobody was saying, oh, there's about to be a big nationwide movement here. And there in May 68, it appeared. And it didn't appear out of nowhere, but it seemed to, because people just weren't expecting this. And even the people that participated in them were kind of surprised, like, wow, look what we got. Now what did we do? And then you have so we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 3, 2 weeks from now. And then we have some common objections. And here I go into these things like, oh, that'll never work. It might work if everybody was angels, but blah, 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 you know. And I reply to that, it would be truer to say that if everyone were angels, the present system might work tolerably well. Businessmen would be honest and politicians would be, you know, the problem is that now, as we see, it's not a matter of is everybody angels. It's just the present system makes it easy, very easy for real devils to take power. What are we in the middle of right now? I mean, we have people in power that are like Antichrist types, and they're in power because of this system. You know, if you had any number of other types of systems, nobody would have dreamed of saying, oh, let's give all the power to this guy or something. So actually, if you're talking about what is practical and realistic, you know, the arguments can go quite the other way. Let's see. And then a couple of pages later, so many potential abuses or disasters are evoked at the suggestion of a non-hierarchical society. You know, when people like me say, oh, we could have this, people say, oh, that would never work because of blah, blah, blah. That it would be impossible to answer all these objections. People who resignedly accept a system that condemns millions of their fellow human beings to death every year in wars and famines, and millions of others to prison and torture, suddenly let their imagination and their indignation run wild at the thought that in a self-managed society, i.e., a post-revolutionary society, there might be some abuses, some violence or coercion or injustice, or merely some temporary inconvenience. They forget that it is not up to a new social system to solve all our problems. It merely has to deal with them better than the present system does, which is hardly a very big order. So It said, if history followed the complacent opinions of official commentators, there would never have been any revolutions. If in any given situation, there are always plenty of ideologists ready to declare that no radical change is possible. If the economy is functioning well, they will claim that revolution depends on economic crises. If there's an economic crisis, others will just as confidently declare that revolution is impossible because people are too busy worrying about making ends meet, and et cetera. Any comments on that or questions? Danny?
I just want to say that I really liked how you handled these objections. The part about if everyone were angels, yeah, like the way you turn that around, I thought was very clever, and yeah, and it's not up to a new social system to solve all our problems. It merely has to deal with them better than the present system does. I thought that was very well put.
Thank you. Lisa?
There we go. I'm unmuted. Oh, I think the whole, I agree with the last comment. I'm going to piggyback that I really like the way you've handled this. There's a kind of clarity in something that's really probably entropic. But in trying to understand that, I was looking at your list of notable examples like Russia, 1905, Germany, Italy, Spain, 1936. And I don't know enough about history. So my question to you and the group is, what role do individuals play in this anomalous ability to bring about revolutionary change? For instance, Trotsky in 1905, or I thought about our own country when we had an incredible trifecta, Martin Luther King Jr., RFK, JFK. So I was thinking maybe that's a missing piece, that somebody steps forward and provides leadership, which would be the converse correlate of the devilish leadership, for instance, we're experiencing now. So that's my question. How much do you think individuals would explain the ability to buck history and start these, or buck the historical tendencies and bring about change?
Yeah, well, these, sure, there are always going to be, like in Spain, there were certain leaders, of which one of the most exemplary was a guy named Buenaventura Durruti, who was an anarchist and in jail a lot and underground during the preceding decades. And when the revolution burst forth in 1936, people naturally who were in there did, to an extent, look to him. Like if he was, figuratively speaking, on the barricade with the flag of anarchism or something like this. He ended up leading an anarchist militia, and it was very successful. In fighting back the fascists and so on like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it had those contradictions that you have, which I'm not even going to go into about, well, how do you have a military thing? Like he was the leader, but he did it in a different way than an army functions.
And Ken,
yeah.
I forgot one other part of my question.
Okay.
So, that really leads me to thinking about um, maybe there's not exactly a pattern, but a phenomenon that occurs because you have this individual that could articulate and appeal to people. But at the same time, you have artists and writers like Orwell, right? I mean, maybe I can ask Ed or some that were instrumental in writing about Catalonia and
Right.
Spain. So
Absolutely.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering, maybe I keep thinking, because I'm biased this way, that the arts will save us, you know, like I love what's happening with, you know, the Kennedy Center but anyway, so that's my thought. Not only does leadership step forward, but what other institutions like the Fourth Estate or um, um, global, maybe even movements.
Yeah.
Because some days I wake up and think, please, Germany, you learned, come save us, you know? So that's my thought.
Yeah. Well, for example, when the Situationists were starting in the 1950s, this was one of the things they asked themselves. I mean, some of them were artists of sorts, but they were artists in the kind of extremist thing, like they were sort of in the tradition of Dadaism and Surrealism. So, not like the classical symphony or something like that. But they're looking at that and they're not just dismissing that kind of thing. They realize that that can have some effect in changing people's minds or hearts or, subverting in different ways. But they also saw a lot of failures of that. They could say, oh, this realist intended to change the world. And then what happens 20 years later? What did it amount to? Well, you have a few paintings in museums and rich people's homes. And, it's not necessarily even that you can say, oh, the surrealists sold out or something. Part of that's just how the society is able to co-opt these things. And if you mentioned these political leaders or something, we hardly even need to say co-opting. They're already in political positions where they're doing a lot of other things. Maybe they help along civil rights or something like that, but they also help along starting the Vietnam War. And there's a jillion other things about the existing society that they're not doing anything about. In fact, they're working in the other direction. So it just happens that so this question of leadership I'm not just dismissing, like we don't want any leaders, but we don't want leaders. It doesn't work if you have leaders that are government bureaucrats. Then you get somebody like Trotsky, who was a genuine revolutionary, and when he gets in power, he becomes part of you know, he's not the Stalinist thing, but it ends up being the same kind of thing. And then people say, oh, how did that happen? Well, it happened because you're going back to the uh, let's see, how did
We call it the Robespierre effect, you know,
right. So
the
clearly we don't want that. That's an earlier thing of the Stalinist, Leninist kind of thing. So Ed Matthews.
Yeah, you can hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Just a couple of quick comments. In this first chapter, and I know we're going to read the whole book, I start sensing a very sobering common sense, the sort of looking at the history of revolution. And that's the first thing I really appreciated. And in this particular section, the one just before, you mentioned not that revolutions failed, but the fact that many of them actually accomplished what they did. And that kind of dialectical thinking allows us to at least go back and look to see what were the conditions that brought it into being, and perhaps the conditions that made it fall apart. Can we recognize that in the present day?
No.
Now, having said that, what is remarkable right now, and I'm not saying that it's a full-on revolution, but certainly the world is in turmoil in terms of people responding as a population, whether it's the No Kings rallies or what's happening in Albania, what happened in Hungary last month. The problem is it isn't changing the system, but people are clearly ready to step out of their comfort zone and get into the street. So I'm just wondering if, in a perfect world, could you see one of those responses, we'll say, moving to that next step and really threatening the system that they are part of? Because as you pointed out, these systems will continue to perpetuate because it's attacking a person, not the system itself.
Definitely. But as you may recall, at the end of De Boer's Society of the Spectacle film, when he's gone through all these political things, and we've seen these images of May 68, very dramatic and all that. And then when he gets to the very end, he says something like, it is obviously going to be necessary to have a lot of movements like May 68 before we succeed. In other words, it's almost inevitable that any of these kind of movements are going to do something, and then, it's going to only be in one country, or there will be, there's various problems that they'll come up with because they're up against the inertia of this global system that's been working for centuries. But so he says, but when you look at something like May 68, like I said, nobody except the situationists were saying that anything like that was in the works. And when it happened, suddenly, just starting with just a few people, when you talk about the leadership issue, there weren't, some of that was provoked by just a few situationist inspired people, but in this particular case, it just triggered something. So we're going to look at other things like that could come up, and we just don't know which of them is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And even if it breaks the camel's back, that's not enough, right? But we have, Rosa Luxemburg said, in revolution, we lose every battle but the last one. And that's something to think about. I mean, when I mentioned these things, you could say May 68 was a success in a way. It certainly wasn't crushed and so on. But in a way, you could say, okay, it didn't overthrow global capitalism. And Rosa is saying, of course not. Like by definition, you're going to lose, you're going to keep on losing as you attack, and then hopefully, finally, it all gives way in such a way that you can follow it up with something positive.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to move on, since we're to get into chapter 2. And chapter 2 I call Foreplay, whereas chapter 3 is called Climaxes. So in these next two chapters, I'm looking at radical tactics, strategies, and under two conditions. And in this condition that we're going to look at right now is so-called ordinary condition. It's like right now, even though we've got this Trump bullshit, it's sort of not totally ordinary. But in general, things are going on. People are going to work and getting paid and paying taxes and, running for office and all this kind of stuff. And in other words, it's kind of business as usual. What do you do in that? And that's mostly where we live. Most of our lives have been spent that way. Just every once in a while, a May 68 comes up, or if you want to get an Occupy movement or something, and said, wait a minute, this is weird. What's going on here? But 99% of the time, we're in this other condition. And so I'm now starting here, what are various things that people do in that situation where it is not on the verge of revolution? And we all know that. So it would not make any sense for me to say, hey, let's go occupy City Hall. You know, we would just get arrested and everybody would think, what kind of morons are, you know, it would be, so what are things that we can do? And so I start off with personal breakthroughs. And here I'm talking about just individuals that was brought up earlier, like just you and me. You know, what am I going to do? Am I going to start a conversation with that person? Am I going to object to that thing? Am I going to make a speech somewhere on the street corner? Am I going to write a leaflet? Am I going to post something on the internet? You know, am I going to suggest to my fellow workers that maybe we should strike or object to something? Or, you know, there's all these things. So this chapter, I'm going through those different things. You know, like what can you do? Well, for one thing, you could start with yourself. And people do that sometimes, like, oh, I need to settle accounts with this issue. I need to deal with this problem. I'm always doing this. I'm always screwing up this. How do I do it? So then we get all sorts of things. Oh, I'm going to start meditating. Well, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe I'm going to have a conversation with a friend and see what they think. So all these things go on zillions of times every day. And then a few times they can, the next subchapter is critical interventions. You decide, oh, here is this issue, this event, and I'm going to do something about it or try something. And then, like, maybe I'm going to complain about some situation at my work or in my school or something, or I'm going to critique this group, whatever. And so I go into the different levels, you know, stages that those kind of things happen. Like you criticize a group, what happens? Well, the group reacts defensively. Then what do? How do you anticipate that? And so on. So one of the things I mentioned is just publicizing things. You know, like if you talk to your friend and about some political issue, maybe you convince your friend to have a little different belief or to vote for a different person or something. But if that's all it is, it's not going, you know, that's a rather minimal thing. But if you decide, oh, I'm going to challenge this group, such and such a group, a little political group or a social group or something, you know, it could be anything, you know, then I say, how do you do that? You can do it in person, but then it's just word of mouth or something. What if you write it down and publish it? Publish in the sense of like distributing a leaflet or posting it online. Now you're talking to maybe 100 people or 1,000 people saying, I suggest this, I denounce this, I don't like this. And then you get different responses. And I could say, well, you write a letter to one person, that's one thing. But what if you write an open letter? It's to that person, but you send copies to your website or something. And then I say, if you succeed in creating a chain reaction in which more and more people read your text because they see others reading it and heatedly discussing it, it will no longer be possible for anyone to pretend to be unaware of the issues you have raised. So in other words, I'm trying to say, how can you force your way into what you have to say, getting to more people and making them, whoa, what's that? And I give an example in a footnote here of what the SI did in 1958. The SI, this little group of a dozen or so people, decide that they're going to criticize a gathering of an international gathering of art critics that is taking place in Brussels. And so You can imagine different ways they could have just written an article about it or something, but no, they want to make sure, they want to actually go there and stir things up. So here's how they describe what they did. Quote, so they wrote a critique of this event. Copies were mailed to a large number of the critics or given to them personally. Others were telephoned and read all or part of the text. A group forced its way into the press club where the critics were being received and threw the leaflets among the audience. Others were tossed onto the sidewalks from upstairs windows or from a car. In short, all steps were taken to leave the critics no chance of being unaware of the text, unquote. So I just mentioned this as a little, like, this is how they were doing it. There are just a few people, and people were saying, what the hell is this? Who would have been ignored, and suddenly they do this. And so then suddenly it gets in the papers, you know, and other people are reading about it, including people like me and others much later that says, oh, they're giving us a hint about one little, very simple tactic. You barge in and put it in their face. Danny.
I was starting to think that this tactic doesn't have the same power these days. And then I recalled that just yesterday, a group of highly respected diabetes scientists handed out a leaflet at a conference. They were ejected and it's front page news.
Very good. So that's just one example, but there are various others, like and then in talking about what is this thing that you're talking about? What's the process of talking about these things? And this gets to the question of theory. And I claim to theorize, which is what we're doing, I mean, what the situationists were doing that way, is simply to try to understand what we are doing. We are all theorists whenever we honestly discuss what has happened, distinguish between significant and irrelevant, see through fallacious explanations, recognize what worked and what didn't, consider how something might be done better next time. Radical theorizing is simply talking or writing to more people about more general issues in more abstract, i.e., more widely applicable terms. Even those who claim to reject theory theorize. They merely do so unconsciously and capriciously, and thus more accurately. Theory without particulars is empty, but particulars without theory are blind. Practice tests theory, but theory also inspires new practice. And then I go on in the next subchapter, avoiding false choices and elucidating real ones. So again, this theorizing often involves doing exactly that. It's like saying, here we have an issue. Let's break it down. What are we really talking about here? Supposedly the issue is A versus B, but maybe A and B are actually fairly similar. And there's some other issue here, like what is the hidden thing that they both have in common or something like that. So you might analyze means to break up things. You go into some lump and you break it apart and say, oh, it actually consists of various different things. And then you can do the opposite thing. You can take a lot of diverse different things and say, well, these are all just instances of some general thing. And so, let's see. Then here I quote Vanagem, one of the situationists. quote, everyone is asked their opinion about every detail in order to prevent them from forming one about the totality. So we've seen this in different ways, like when we're asked to vote for somebody or something, that's one thing, like who, you know, somebody is saying, here's the choices, folks. Who are they to be saying that? And we might say, wait a minute, you've presented us with a false choice. And they might say, well, tough luck, sucker. You don't have any alternative. Because if you don't vote for this guy, an even worse guy is there. So you've suddenly gotten derailed onto this, and maybe that's appropriate to do. I mean, I vote for dumb people, because they're a lot better than something else, or so, naturally, that's going to be the case. But you also have to look at the case and say, let's not assume that all the relevant debates are about who to vote for, or to vote yes or no on this referendum or something like that. A lot of times we're asked our opinion about this or that, or all these things. And in a way that we can't see the forest for the trees there. So, as I say, many issues are such emotionally loaded tar babies that anyone who reacts to them becomes entangled in false choices. The fact that two sides are in conflict, for example, does not mean that you must support one or the other. If you can't do anything about a particular problem, it's best to clearly acknowledge this fact and move on to something that does present practical possibilities. So if you do decide to choose a lesser evil, admit it. Don't add to the confusion by whitewashing your choice or demonizing the enemy. If anything, it's better to do the opposite, to play devil's advocate and neutralize compulsive polemical deliriums by calmly examining the strong points of the opposing position and the weaknesses in your own. And here I have a quote from Nietzsche. A very popular error, having the courage of one's convictions. The point is to have the courage for an attack on one's convictions. So anyway, I'm just throwing that in there, just like Nietzsche threw it in one of his books, just to, Danny.
Reading that caused me to go out and look up a term that I'd seen floating by that I never quite understood, called steel manning, where you, oh, great, now I've already forgotten. Essentially, where you do the best to improve the, oh Lord, I'm so tired, I can't remember. Never mind, I'll go look it up and report next time.
Okay, fine. Stuart, you haven't talked. Go ahead. Then we'll get back to Ed. Unmute yourself, Stuart. You're still muted. Stuart, try just holding down your space bar. Put your hand on the space bar and hold it down.
No,
Okay.
I probably, yeah, no, sorry about that. I'm on my
That's
phone.
an emergency thing. Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm on my phone this time, so I don't have that.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I found this so incredibly helpful. Going back to the theory thing.
Going back to what? We're not hearing you now, although you're not muted. Ed Matthews, let's go to you, and Stuart, see if you can figure out what's happening. We weren't hearing you. Ed.
Yeah, I was just going to say this section reminded me a lot of a very helpful section in the Grundrisse, where Marx says, be careful with terminology. That's often they couch and cover over many subtleties and sort of, subsidiary ideas that are intentionally hidden within these very simple terms. And I think he breaks down like the word population, for example. This little section reminded me of how well that can work, where you can identify what you think is a problem, and then when you look at it carefully, you write about it, think about it, reflect and theorize, then you can distinguish between the symptom and the cause. Okay, are there several causes? Is it one of these causes that I can deal with right now? Can I do this on my own? Can I do it collectively? So again, that kind of sobering common sense that I see running through these two chapters, and I would assume the rest of the book, that it's just really a step back from the almost religious fervor of revolution, but a more sobering and disinterested look, we'll say, which is often helpful because revolution, the images of people acting in a radical manner, but no, sometimes it requires thought. Who is the true enemy? Like, where are its weak points, and where can we push hardest? So that section reminded me a lot of what Marx was telling us to, be mindful of these terms that are often, almost intentionally vague. We should be careful of those.
Yeah. As De Boer said one time, even in a street fight, you have to think.
Yeah.
So, and then on the De Boer thing here, when I've talked about these, so continuing where I was reading there about combine modesty with audacity. Remember that if you happen to accomplish anything, it is on the foundation of the efforts of countless others, many of which have faced horrors that would make you or me crumple into submission. But don't forget that what you say can make a difference. Within a world of pacified spectators, even a little autonomous expression will stand out. And then I go on, since there are no longer any material obstacles to inaugurating a classless society, that is, we don't have any it's not that there's not enough food to go around or enough houses. It's purely a matter of how do we want to organize things. So the only thing standing in our way, the problem has essentially been reduced to a question of consciousness. The only thing that really stands in the way is people's unawareness of their own collective powers. Obviously, if you have 1,000 people bossed around by one person, those 1,000 people only need to realize that one person is not magic. He's not up there because God put him there or something. You can ignore him. You can, do whatever. And if those 1,000 people are still hypnotized there, that's the problem. It's not that there's some way, so as I say, physical repression is effective against radical minorities only so long as social conditioning keeps the rest of the population docile. So hence, hence a large element of radical practice is negative, attacking the various forms of false consciousness that prevent people from realizing their positive potentialities. And then I mentioned Marx and the situationists as examples of people who have often been criticized for that. Oh, you're always just criticizing for this. But I'm just saying, actually, accurately expressing a key issue often has a surprisingly powerful effect. Bringing things out into the open forces people to stop hedging their bets and take a position. Like the dexterous butcher in the Taoist fable, whose knife never needed sharpening because he always cut between the joints. The most effective radical polarization comes not from strident protest, but from simply revealing the divisions that already exist, elucidating the different tendencies, contradictions, choices. Much of the situation's impact stemmed from the fact that they articulated things that most people had already experienced, but were unable or afraid to express until someone else broke the ice. There's a famous situationist quote, "Our ideas are in everybody's mind." That doesn't mean they put them there. They meant we're talking about what's already there, but maybe in a rather confused form. So then I also talk about radical film a little bit in De Boer, but I won't go there because we just got done with looking at De Boer's radical films. And Craig, unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I guess so. On 25, where you say, since there are no longer any material obstacles to inaugurating classless society, the problem has essentially been reduced to a question of consciousness. So, that's when I was younger, that's why I rejected some situationist thought to some degree, because there's a way in which it didn't comport with what I had seen, like as a worker, like when I was like working in a hospital, for example, on the overnight shift, and like people would exchange, would like take time taking extra breaks. So like they would cover each other's shift, and they would like therefore like steal back time. I was like, oh, well, this isn't just a matter of like consciousness. Like workers have figured out a way to like take back time on the clock here, but like it's much more than that. I guess I would raise the question a little bit of like, there's a real risk in this that it just turns into like, if we just educate people, then like we would just be able to get to, like a better world, which has always seemed also really crazy to me as a political concept. Like if, people have all sorts of revolutionary thoughts in their brains, they often also have fascist thoughts in their brains.
Right.
And so like the issue doesn't feel to me consciousness. And I'm curious just to sort of, I think about it through the lens of everyday resistance as like a way to try to pierce it a little bit, but I'm curious about how you think about it, about like false consciousness as like a problematic concept.
Yeah. I would say when you're that hospital thing that you're mentioning, uh, if you had asked the situationists, they would say that's exactly what we're talking about. What do you think we're talking about? In other words, this is what they're doing even before they had before somebody came to them and said, resist at work, or da da da. This is what's going on, and it's because of that the situationists could write whole books about, like von Hergé's The Revolution of Everyday Life, which is about nothing other than precisely that kind of thing you were talking about the hospital workers doing. They're in a situation and they don't like it, and they do something about it. And what they do about it in that particular case is very minimal. Of course, most of what we do is very minimal. I mean, we can't overhaul the hospital single-handedly or something. But in other words, given where we are, given where those workers were, they decide, oh, let's do this. And they probably didn't consult their union or ask the boss if it's okay that they do this. They just did it. And merely the fact that they're doing it already demonstrates some interesting consciousness there. Judy.
Oh yeah, and the when he's talking about film and he's talking about how it doesn't really help anything very much, he says catering to people's self-satisfaction by presenting spectacles of triumphant radical heroism only reinforces this bondage. I mean, don't you think it kind of inspires people too?
Sometimes, yeah. So you have to bear in mind that it can sound exciting, like, oh, we're going to show a picture of, like if we took an example of the hospital thing, we're going to show a picture of hospital workers striking or something. And that could be interesting. It could be informative. Oh, they came up with that idea, and why are they doing it, and what would be the solution? And then you would have further debates about, is the solution to raise their wages or to give them fewer hours so that they're not overworked, or I mean, there's all these different kind of issues there on a kind of small specific level. But so a film could show that, and that could be inspiring. But on the other hand, it can have the opposite effect. Like if you show something like where workers are seemingly easily taking over a hospital and doing all kinds of good things, then it makes it seem like, oh, we could never do that. It becomes a fantasy. Or it becomes like, oh, those workers did that and then they got arrested. And heroic workers, yay. But does that necessarily inspire you? Maybe it inspires you to think, boy, I better not do that or I might get arrested.
Well, it's interesting because if you watch documentaries about strikes, there's rarely a hero in them. They're more collective. But if
Right.
the Hollywood movies, there's always, coal miner's daughter.
Right. Yeah.
So it is a different narrative. It's true.
Yeah. And for example, I'll give you an example coming up later this year. We read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia last year. And one of my French situationist friends from the old days became a radical filmmaker in his later years. And he's just made a film of Homage to Catalonia, in which it's a documentary. The film stuff is all documentaries from the time. It's not a fiction film or something. And the narration is from Orwell's book. And so I guarantee you that I can say almost sight unseen, that's going to be a very impactful film. Very suggestive and informative and all that. But we'll see. It may have problems in that it focuses too much on Orwell as a hero or so. Yeah, but in other words, using that kind of stuff, yes, absolutely. You can use that. It's informative in the same way that you can read books about the Spanish Revolution or about May 68 or whatever, and learn and be inspired by those things. So, but I'm just saying, in general, if you have a radical film festival or something, the films there, when I go to, I don't usually care much for them. They have a sort of corny moral usually. And, where the good guys win out in the end. And so that's supposed to show. So anyway, so I'm going to move on to, so we can get through this. The next subsection I have is oppressionism versus playfulness. But before I have there, we have Ivan Shcheglov appearing from beyond the grave.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to touch on what Mike and Judy had talked about, and I thought it was really good. The thing that occurred to me is something I think about all the time, which is that I think what you have is as far as like this issue of is this whole project a matter of consciousness, and do we need to spread the gospel? Mike talked about millenarianism, and is this is Marxism in general, or the proletarian project, just like basically Christian eschatology in disguise and that sort of thing. I understand what he's getting at and some of his criticisms and that kind of thing. But I think that tying it back to what you were talking about with culture and film and media and things like that, is that it's kind of this problem of that what the spectacle has done for the last, say, 100 years or whatever, is raise generations of people who only know how to passively consume information. And so what to me, what the point seems is that is the problem, is that
Yes.
it's not just a matter of putting the right things in front of people, because you can put better things in front of people. You can put more left-wing media or things like that, or even that are, as revolutionary ideology in front of people, and it will have possibly some sort of a positive effect, but it's not going to build the revolution and get people to go out and start
That's right.
actually really changing the world collectively in real life. There's there's so much talk these days about being on the internet versus going out and touching grass. And you can be an internet leftist all day long forever and never affect anything.
You can also go out and touch grass all day and
right, exactly, absolutely. Yeah. One quick question I did want to ask, though. I love that quote that you had from Rosa Luxemburg, and I was just wondering where it was from. About the final battle being the only one that you win in revolution.
I don't know offhand. If you just type that into Google or something, I'm sure it'll say this is from her pamphlet, blah, blah, blah.
Sure. Thanks.
But on when we're talking about consciousness, I don't mean it's just consciousness, but what I was saying in that sentence was that given that we don't have an actual objective material obstacle there. In other words, there's nothing about the stuff on Earth now that says that we can't feed everybody. And in fact, there are more buildings now than there are homeless people. So the question is, how are we organizing the stuff that we have, particularly considering that we have all these different technologies that could develop so that you would, have a technology that makes something with very little labor, that makes a useful thing. But instead, we're putting all of that to make bombs or stuff like that, so on. So in other words, it's not like there's something holding us back. Like if we were 3,000 years ago, maybe it's a different matter. We could say, well, at this point, aren't we sort of doomed to have people starving to death and all that? Because it's a big, I mean, maybe. Anyway, we certainly couldn't live in the lap of luxury. But now we could. Everybody could. So that's only a shorthand way of saying that. So say the only way that's stopping that is that certain people in power or certain systems in power are zombifying everybody so that they can't even conceive of it, hardly. So I want to go on with this. This will relate oppressionism versus playfulness. And I say to rely on oppressive conditions to radicalize people is unwise. To intentionally worsen them in order to accelerate this process is unacceptable. Sometimes bad situations do provoke people to revolt, but a lot of times they just provoke people to give up or to go off into some crazy escape. The point that I'm kind of paraphrasing the situationists here, the point is to reveal the contrast between present conditions and present possibilities, to give people enough taste of real life that they'll want more. And so I quote, people's consciousness is not, quote, raised by burying them under an avalanche of horror stories or even under an avalanche of information. The thing, it may be sometimes necessary to do that, just to put it in your face. Hey, look how ugly this is. Stop. But in general, that's not the kind of thing that inspires people to do interesting experiments and so on. So to get back to this art thing, strident leftist propaganda fixating on the insidiousness and loathsomeness of, quote, oppressors often feeds this delirium, appealing to the most morbid and morbid and mean-spirited side of people. If we get caught up in brooding on evils, if we let the sickness and ugliness of this society pervade even our rebellion against it, we forget what we were fighting for and end up losing the very capacity to love, to create, to enjoy. And so I say the best so-called radical art cuts both ways. And that's why we think, oh, this is pretty good. If it attacks the alienation of modern life, it simultaneously reminds us of the poetic potentialities hidden within it. Rather than reinforcing our tendency to wallow in self-pity, it encourages our resilience, enables us to laugh at our own troubles as well as at the asininities of the forces of so-called order. Some of the old IWW songs and comic strips are good examples of this, or the ironic, bittersweet songs of Brecht and Weil. And then I mentioned Good Soldiers Fight. Nothing undermines authority like holding it up to ridicule. The most effective argument against a repressive regime is not that it is evil, but that it is silly. And our next thing, after we've had 5 meetings of Joy Revolution, and the next thing after that is a novel on that very theme. I'll go on, describe this. It is described here. The protagonists of this novel, Alfred Kosseri's The Jokers, living under an unnamed Middle Eastern dictatorship, plaster the walls of the capital with an official-looking poster that praises the dictatorship to such a preposterous degree that he becomes a laughingstock and is forced to resign out of embarrassment. Kosseri's pranksters are apolitical and their success is perhaps too good to be true, but some similar parodies have been used with more radical aims. For example, at demonstrations in Italy in the 1970s, the Metropolitan Indians, that was a kind of radical, wacky group, carried banners and chanted slogans such as "Power to the bosses," "More work, less pay." Everyone recognized the irony, but it was harder to dismiss with the usual pigeonholing. So anyway, this is just like humor is a healthy antidote to all kinds of orthodoxy, left as well as right. It's highly contagious, and it reminds us not to take ourselves too seriously. But it can easily become a mere safety valve, channeling dissatisfaction into glib, passive cynicism. The spectacle society thrives on delirious reactions against its most delirious aspects. Satirists often have a dependent love-hate relation with their targets. Parodies become indistinguishable from what they are parodying, given the impression that everything is equally bizarre, meaningless, and hopeless. So, I mean, we are kind of in the middle of a situation like that every day. So following that, I talk about the Strasbourg scandal, which I'm not going to go into, but this was a scandal where the situationists used some of these things we've been talking about: satire, intervention, invading, twisting the language around, coming up with unexpected denunciations, and so on. And it was very successful, immensely successful, and it was an indirect forerunner of May 68. So I talk about them. So do we have any other comments on these recent things here I talked about? Ed Matthews.
Yeah, I just wanted to say very quickly that the 2 sections we looked at, what I find so important is what you point out, that the way in which we can move things forward is not only presenting those present conditions, but the possibilities from within. And when I was taking my third run through all the SI work, I was finding that thread running through a lot of their own work in my claim that they were utopian, not in the traditional sense, but in the sense you present here, that they were seeing these potential present possibilities and said, look, that utopia isn't on the horizon far away. It's here and now, right? We need to exploit those present conditions to then find those possibilities and then go with that. So the fact that you pointed out really so much radical art just doesn't have that second aspect, right? The other half of the coin, the possibilities, because yeah, we need to be educated, but as you point out, the spectacle has the tendency to make us more passive, right? More defeatist. But to present those possibilities in the here and now makes that kind of radical art so much more effective.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just pause here and call on a few people who we haven't heard from. John Soul, do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, please. I have a couple of comments and a few questions.
Please.
First, I just want to say that it was lucid throughout. I really enjoyed reading it because the language was clear, concise, well thought out, and it was a comprehensive explanation of the concepts and the traps. And it was like looking through clear water, really beautiful writing. A couple of things. This sentence I particularly liked. Sometimes it only takes a little jolt to break through the stupor. I thought that was really good. And then I liked the idea of you doing the foreplay and the climax and rebirth. So we went through the foreplay. I'm really excited about the climax and rebirth. And this sentence, which is a little long, blew my mind because of the last word. Page 41. Or no, yeah, let me put my glasses on. Page 41. Aside from the reactionary demagogues who are pleasantly surprised to find progressives providing them with such easy targets for ridicule, the only people who actually benefit from these internecine squabbles are a few careerists struggling for bureaucratic posts, government grants, academic tenure, publishing contracts, commercial clienteles, or political constituencies at a time when there's increasingly limited space at the trough. So they're
Thank you. And that's talking about political correctness.
Yeah, pigs at the trough. I love the trough. And then it's followed by the next word, sniffing. So just the kind of reference to pigs was beautiful. Sniffing out political incorrectness enables them to bash rivals, etc. I have a couple of questions. The statistic on children dying of starvation, 20,000 in the end note, you say 20 to 40,000. That's in America, not worldwide.
That's worldwide.
Millions. Worldwide, I
Yeah.
see. Okay.
We're talking about every day.
Every day, worldwide. Yeah. Okay.
So obviously, most of those are like in Africa and,
right.
Southern Asia and so on.
I see. And also you make in the same section, the point that I really liked, which was also often spoken about in the 1960s about violence. Whenever people brought up violence, then I remember the radicals always saying, don't talk about violence against the system, because the system, the status quo is violent. And if you don't accept that premise, you can't talk about the resistance being violent. And that point over the years has been kind of lost in the narrative. It's kind of back to the thing of how violent are protesters through the media. So I was happy to see that point brought up again. Then I have three questions. The first is, you've known Alice Debord and other situationists, although you never met Guy Debord. Have you gotten any feedback on your book from the French comrades, or would you rather speak about that at the end or later on?
Well, remember that The Joy of Revolution text came out in 1997.
Yeah, but you've been friends with some of these people forever.
I mean, this has more recent texts in the last half of the book, but
no, I mean the original one too. Just
the original one you know, was immediately translated into French. So
Hmm.
that indicates something.
Yes,
And
nice.
it was, there was a pirate edition in French published in French Canada in Quebec.
Wow.
Um, and most of, you know, so yeah, this and most of my other writings have been very favorably received in France. I mean,
And also, you've been translated into 5 languages with this book.
yeah.
What are the other languages, and have you heard anything about how those books have been received in those countries?
Well, maybe the one that's most interesting is that it was translated into Russian by a guy in Kazakhstan, Joy of Revolution, early on, you know, like within a year or two, via, because I was online, you know, he had never even seen the book. He had just seen the online version. And so this guy in Kazakhstan translated it, and it was published by an anarcho-syndicalist workers group in Kazakhstan.
Wow, cool.
And then, starting from that edition, there was a second edition in Moscow by some regular publisher of the same translation. So I actually have 2 different editions of Joy of Revolution in Russia. I thought that was pretty cool.
Nice, very cool. And lastly, on a broader subject of you as a writer, when you were in Shimer College, did you already want to be a writer? Because you've written about your evolution as a thinker from anarchist to situationist, and you took up translating French to delve deeper into the situationist. But when did you decide to be a writer and support yourself with side jobs?
Well, I would, first of all, I wouldn't say that I'm a writer. I never decided, like in the 60s, I wrote a few poems, you know, back when we were taking acid all the time and all that kind of thing. I was really into, you know, Allen Ginsberg and Gary Snyder, as well as all the stuff that Rex Roth talks about. But no, I never even thought about being a writer. Like I never wrote a short story or a novel, and like I said, the poems were just a few little passing things.
But a political critic.
It was only, yeah, when I discovered the situationists, that's when I wrote my first leaflets. Like I thought, oh, I could write a leaflet like they did. You know, and actually my first 2 leaflets were writings were leaflets about Rex Roth and Gary Snyder, done in 1969. And then, but anyway, when I started to get like, oh, what are the situations? I was interested in anarchism, and then when I discovered the situationists, I thought, oh, well, how does that work? What are they doing? And I would meet, we meet some other people, and I see, oh, they did this leaflet, or they did this scandalous intervention here. How do you do that? How does that work? And so I and another friend, another Shimer College student, experimented doing leaflets. And we would have never even thought of that without the situationists. The situationists were the models, like, oh, I wonder if we can do something that's kind of subversive and sneaky, you know, bringing in this sort of combination of anarchism and Marx and Cultural Revolution and so on. And so that led me to doing some leaflets and so on. And then later on to translating and, you know, writing some pamphlets and so on. But all that came out, and it was just sort of secondarily that 2 decades later, I got back to Rex Roth, who I'd sort of put on the shelf a little bit, and wrote that little book about him. You know, like saying, how does Rex Roth fit in with this stuff, was kind of it.
But you've also reviewed 5,000 books, I believe. Is that true?
Rex Roth reviewed more than 5,000 books on KPFA.
No.
No, I haven't.
But don't you have some reviews that you have online of yours you're reviewing? Oh, that was Rex Roth.
Yeah, I have all those hundreds of Rexroth things.
Uh-huh.
No, I've reviewed only just very few books, you
I
know.
see.
I mean, I put out a thing on my website that said, here's my recommended books list or something. But
And
there
how
I'm
many-
just sort of
How many are on that list?
like 500 books.
500. Okay.
It's like my top 5, you know, and it's radical books as well as literature and Buddhism and history and all kinds of different things.
Thank you.
Okay, let me see. Other people here. Gerhard, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. This has been a wonderful opportunity to re-explore this book, which in my years following you, we've visited before. And so this is really great to come back and consolidate our appreciation for what you've done here. I particularly like it, the fact that you're widening it to so many venues and so many groups, so many means of reaching for this liberation. And so this really fits in with me, particularly now looking at such things as structural media theory, which I was brought to a lot by looking at these films we just finished with. And also looking at groups that continue in this vein of thinking about utopian conditions or improving the world. I'm thinking now about Burning Man, something that's often looked at as like, oh, Burning Man, isn't that passé? But in fact, it's a gift economy. And it continues decades into it being more important than ever, including particularly with Burners Without Borders all over the world, traveling between festivals. I'm also thinking a lot about our group, which is the Transition Town group. Worldwide, started in the UK by people who are basically concerned about climate change and about fossil fuels. And so it's worldwide in many, many countries. And we've lived this life. We're doing it today. And now, most of all, seeing the people each week that come out on the streets for No Presidents. We have one that takes place 2 blocks from here. I was just the other day, and I was really remarking on how much you see of grassroots energy in the signs, the signage, which I think points back to the kind of thing carried out by the Situationists in Paris and other places in France and around the world. So I'm quite glad. Particularly, I want to finish with this. You've oftentimes talked about the weaknesses of electoral politics. I spent my professional life for almost 25 years serving the US Congress in San Francisco as a researcher, as an investigator, and as support for auditing on the whole West Coast. And I saw so much that came of various government involvements in many policies. And so I've always tried to reconcile your dismissal of the electoral process. And this is especially germane since we just came through this process in California of trying to select among candidates for governor. And of course, I went for the most radical guy, and I'm disappointed now that he didn't make it. Anyway, thanks a lot, Ken.
Yeah. I don't want to say that I dismiss electoral politics. I take part in it, which many anarchists or situationists might consider heretical or something. It just, as I say in actually one of the last subchapters of this thing, we can't go into it right now, but my point is just to know what you're doing. You know, if this is a loaded platform, in which case, you know, that's a lot of things are out of bounds, recognize it. And then if you think that it's nevertheless important, you know, to block off something because if you know, the Trump people are still there, you know, we're going to go into a full fascism or something like that, you know, that there's lesser evils there, go for it. Fine. You know, just be aware that these people who are going to be better than Trump are not, you know, they're not going to solve things. All they're going to do at the very best is put on the brakes a little bit as the world goes down the toilet. You know, we see all this climate change and all these crazy things going on, wars and reactionary religious movements and, you know, just absurd things. I don't have to go into them. And those are continuing. And the kind of thing that just says, well, let's go proceed cautiously or something. It may be better than proceeding like Trump is proceeding, but nevertheless, it's hardly a solution. You have to be aware that what you're doing there is just, it's like one mafia against another, and maybe one mafia is a little more responsible than the other, is not going to just blow up the world instantly. Anyway, none of these things, I mean, I think if you read carefully in here, I'm not dismissing any of them. I'm not dismissing reformism. I'm not dismissing setting up alternative institutions, voting for different people, or voting for different, referendums or whatever. Just be aware of what you're doing and decide, is this the best way to engage my energies? And in some situations, you can say, man, that is pretty pathetic. The energies of 1 million people were completely monopolized on this one voting this one thing, and then the guy gets elected and then betrays you. Duh, as if that's a big surprise, So you can also look at it like saying, what if those people had been doing more direct things instead of things that were just like, please give us a little lesser evil? So those are things that everybody has to work out for themselves. And I'm just, what is a little, like I said, there's sort of orthodox anarchist things that says you don't vote, that's all bullshit. And,
yeah, you're pointing out the boundary conditions,
yeah,
where things work and where they don't. It's very helpful.
And it's not an easy decision. So you may decide that some group or person is, and I may want to put my efforts in something else, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. I mean, actually, like, I'll tell you, I have I'm a Zen Buddhist practitioner, as some of you know, and many of my fellow Zen friends, what they do during elections is that they have what they call an election sesshin. A sesshin is like a meditation thing, where they go someplace where it's a swing state or something like that, and they're working their asses off, going door to door or writing letters or whatever, calling people, in order to get one more Democratic senator elected or something like that. And I donate to them. I can't stomach doing that myself, but I give them a lot of money. I say, go for it. Please, I'm with you. I hope we do get that extra senator elected. But that's just one of many different things. So you have to decide what, where your focus is. So let's see. Sid, do you have any comments or questions?
Thanks, Ken. I wanted to I have probably a couple of questions, and my main, maybe two comments. The one main comment, I'm entirely grateful for this production, what you've produced here. I'm blown away by I'm in total agreement with what John Salt said about the clarity and the simplicity. And so I really I didn't get to finish up to the end of the second chapter, but just the first 4, 5, 6 pages, every sentence built on the next sentence. And it reminded me a little bit of the board, Society of the Spectacle, where you couldn't just like leave a sentence out. Everything you wrote and said was really important, I think. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Also, the other thing, this may be a little off, but what you said about, I think you said Rosa Luxemburg said that, and people were talking about this, what happens with these various moments, revolutionary or revolts or whatever you call them, that you're going to lose all of them until the last one. I thought that was really appropriate, and just parenthetically, it reminds me, I do practice Tai Chi a bit, and there's this partner practice in Tai Chi that's called push hands or sensing hands. And the people who, our predecessors are the people who gave us this practice came up with this expression called invest in loss. And the example was that when you're pushing or sensing with someone of a higher level or even equal or just a little bit better than you, you're gonna be disadvantageous 99 times out of 100. But those 99 times, each time you're learning something. And that's one of the things and then the 100th time, possibly, if you're lucky, the 100th time you may become advantageous. And the fact that you pointed that out and that your book points that out is, to me, important and useful. I did have a question on page 5, and you may have said we'll get to this later, but the question of representative democracy versus delegate democracy, and you say, number one, the first degree of government, quote unquote, is unrestricted freedom. And that was like, what? That to me was like, what the F is that? Because I don't, that's a little bit difficult for me. I mean, I'd love to believe in whatever it is, but I don't actually know what that is.
Well, that would, I'm oversimplifying. That's just to say no government, period.
Uh-huh.
You're just, everybody's winging it. So we don't know how would that work? Obviously any society would have some forms of organization, but this is like an extreme form where you're saying, where it's like,
no rules.
Take me to your leader, and you say, huh? What are you talking about? Whereas under all these other things, you might have a pretty free society, but there's some sort of, oh, talk to him, he's the current something, or go see those people over there, they deal with that, or whatever. So we'll get to actually, when we get to the last chapter where we're talking about post-revolution, we can see how some of those things would play out.
And does that relate to the last part of that, the last paragraph in that page, where your quote, a liberated society would eliminate 4 and 5? That's pretty clear, representative democracy and overt minority dictatorship, and would progressively reduce the need for 2 and 3.
Right.
Which is a little hard for me to understand.
Well, in other words, think about some of the things in your life, like there are things that you just do. If you want to go take a walk, you take a walk, and you don't have to get somebody's approval for it, or there's a lot of things that you either do it, or you and your partner, or you and a few friends get together and do something, and there's no government of any sort.
Right.
Nobody had to vote or something. So,
but when there's something like a shared commodity or shared resource,
then when you've got some socially, thing that what you would, if you're taking a walk impeded something else, then you might have to ask permission. Is this going to disturb you if I walk across here because you're in the middle of something? But assuming that you can see that a lot of things potentially could do with minimal organization. So delegate democracy and direct democracy both imply that it's democracy, that you're voting. You know, you're running something organizedly. Even if you don't have a state or if you don't have something else, you've got an organization or various forms of organization that deal with various things. And that's completely normal. Just like your body has an organization so it doesn't fall apart. So the point is that I'm saying reduce as far as possible the need for 2 and 3. So in other words, we don't want to go out of our way to have to vote for everything. So if there's enough to go around, you don't have to say, well, how are we going to divide this up?
Right.
For example, if you go to a water fountain, that's already communistic. You don't have to vote on who gets to use the fountain. You just go there when you're thirsty and drink. So that's total unrestricted. But if we were in a drought, maybe you couldn't do that. And you have to, hey, restricted to 5 seconds of, something, maybe the water fountain would close down so that people wouldn't waste it. And you'd get only a certain amount because it was desperately needed, so that people wouldn't die of thirst. But that's a case where you could just do whatever you want. Well, there's a lot of cases like that, and it would be nice to expand those so that you usually didn't have to bother with having an agenda and debating with people which is the best way to go, because you could all just do whatever you want. So I'm just saying reduce them. I'm not saying eliminate them.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to say, if I might, is your discussion of the situationists being the ones who just brought to awareness what people were already somehow either conscious or barely conscious or subconscious. I wonder if people feel like that sort of, I just flashed and felt like that feels like something going on today, like that maybe there's all these people in the world, or neighbors and everybody, that it feels like somehow there must be this underlying, I don't know, effluvium or something going in people's consciousness and brains, like living in this world that we're living in now. That it's almost like how ripe it could be for a spark of somebody just saying.
Well, when we get to the end of the book, a couple months from now, my last thing about Trump is called Hive Mind Strikes Back. And it's kind of blurry. I don't have some distinct theory or something, but I had that very sense you're talking about, like there's these millions of people doing all this stuff, and a lot of it is kind of improvised, really. Like who's the leader? And the leaders are not the political people. I mean, there may be some political people like Bernie Sanders or somebody that people respect, but they're not leading anything. People are just coming up with these no kings marches or, different stuff like that. And so I talk about that. It's kind of weird. And in a way, that's just sort of like a rather maybe an early stage of something, like where what's going on is sort of a popular consciousness, but it's certainly not very advanced, but it's advanced enough that people understand, they need to do something.
Yeah.
that part of what they need to do is get out there and communicate,
Mhm.
you know, and say, hey, we're millions of people. What can we do? What's the alternative? What works, what doesn't? Well, that's just what we were already talking about in just this opening chapter.
Thank you.
So I think we'll wind down there, and we have 4 more meetings, and I think the next meetings will be a little easier than this one in that we'll be a little more focused. Our next meeting is about chapter 3, which is climaxes, and it's shorter, and it's talking about what happens when things aren't ordinary, when we do have something like May 68 or the Occupy movement, or you know, some unusual thing like that. So more is up for grabs, you know, than is usual. How to do that? So yes, Dave, unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm in a nosy bar with my Sunday walking group.
Okay.
One, I think you missed an opportunity. Rebirth should really keep in form have entitled Afterglow. and also, I just wanted to say I sat down to read the first 50 pages last night, and I was doing okay, but then, like many men of my age, I got halfway through Foreplay and fell asleep.
Okay. Well, thanks for your efforts anyway. Anyway, I think that the conversation will be a little more focused because we're going to be dealing with things like strikes and sit downs and you know, stuff like that, and see where it goes. We'll talk about May 68, for example, and what the situationists did in that thing. And then similarly, the meeting after that will be after the revolution, if there ever is such a time. What would that look like? And so that's going to be an interesting focus and a little shorter. And then the 2 meetings after that will be some things I've written since then, mostly about the Occupy movement and some things about Trump and a few other things. So anyway, I'll look forward to seeing you all here, and I'll be sending out an email to you tomorrow morning. And thank you again for taking part in this, for your good comments and questions.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bring your friends.
Okay.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay. Going, gone.